Hi, this is the Kevin Bass Show. In this podcast, I'm going to be discussing the latest new trends, investigations, discoveries, and controversies in the fields of health science, nutrition, fitness, and medicine. I am both endlessly overjoyed by the discovery of new knowledge and incredibly happy to share it with you, but also relentlessly critical of anything that is unlikely to pan out or unlikely to be true or useful. Through this dynamic interplay, I make this podcast one of the most intellectually exciting and vibrant among any in this space, both tremendously respected as well as reviled by other prominent health influencers and popular media icons. I draw upon my extensive network of scientists, influencers, thinkers, and thought leaders to bring to you a distilled version of what I believe is the proper take on the latest new ideas and trends in these fields. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome to the Kevin Bass Show. A bit about my background and a disclaimer. I have nearly 20 years either studying medical science or being in a laboratory conducting medical science. Nonetheless, I am only a MD PhD student. I'm not yet a medical doctor, and even if I was, nothing that I'm discussing here would be medical advice, simply a interpretation of the medical literature by a person who reads voraciously and thinks incessantly about how to think about scientific problems and their practical application to health. Correspondingly, you should only take this as such, and always, if you have an idea that you take from this podcast that you want to apply to your own life, you should always talk to your doctor before doing so, and never construe anything you hear as medical advice. And with that, enjoy the Kevin Bass Show. Hey guys, this is Kevin. I'm doing this video with Bart K. It's a discussion. We talk about nutrition. What is the best diet? Why do we believe what we believe with respect to diet? And we discuss the science in great detail. I'm not coming at this with the point of view of trying to prove him wrong or debunk him. I'm just trying to get his view and tell my view and let the viewers decide what they think based on what they hear. I'm really busy with my PhD. We're making some discoveries that may be quite substantial, and then also busy trying to become an elite jiu-jitsu player. So I'm not necessarily interested in getting to big brawls with people, and that should come through here. Bart K has been known to be quite incendiary at times. In fact, in the past I have as well, and it's very interesting that we have this civil discussion going back and forth. Some people have said that I don't push back hard enough against him. It's fine. I pushed back as hard as I felt I needed to, given my desire to have a discussion and not get into a big battle with him. I do state my opinions, and he's pretty respectful. This is part one. We have a part two coming up. I hope this is enjoyable for you. Stay tuned for some more stuff like this. There's going to be a lot more discussions like this coming up in the future. As I said, hope you enjoyed it. Like, subscribe, click a comment, make a comment, and hope you guys enjoy. Peace.
All right, 3, 2, 1. Well, staff, settle down. Boys and girls, thank you for joining us once again. Stop talking down the back. That's enough throwing of paper darts. Today, my special guest is Kevin Bass. Can you not hear me, Kevin?
You clipped out for a second there, but I heard you at the last part. Can you hear me, Kevin? So.
All right. Okay. I was just saying to the class that they need to settle down and stop throwing paper darts and pay attention, because my very special guest is Kevin Bass. So welcome to the show. Are we live
streaming right now?
No, we're not live streaming. We're just recording.
Okay. Good. Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Love it.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, welcome to the show. Kevin, tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I'm an MD PhD student. I've, there's a lot of relevant information, but I've been interested in nutrition and diets and health, fitness, weightlifting and stuff since I was a teenager. I'm in my 30s now. I started out with low carb paleo stuff. That was really big for a while. Then for a while I did plant-based stuff. that was more recent. And then more recently, I've like become disaffected with that community as well. I kind of don't like most of the diet communities. And I was part of like sort of the evidence-based community for a while, and I've become disaffected with them as well. The main reason is I do a lot of self-critique, so I try to find where I could be wrong, and where my tribal affiliation may break off from whatever group I'm a part of. So I try to find critiques of whatever identity that I may have or not have at that given point in time, or intellectual identity, because I'm trying to find ways that I'm wrong. And I also just enjoy the process of learning and growing and changing. So I'm really not a part of any group right now, and I'm not affiliated with anything. I'm kind of aligned with more of a plant-based point of view. I know that you think that's preposterous, but I will say me and you share a lot in common with respect to me and you go after a lot of people very frequently. So we both debunk. I've been debunking people mostly on Twitter for many years now. You go mostly on YouTube. Lately, I've been doing a lot of YouTube, and I love the debunking format. I love going after people. It's not necessarily mean-spirited, although many people can interpret it that way. Sometimes I'm a little bit, I go a little bit, I have a flair for the dramatic sometimes, just because I think people like to see that. And it makes the science more interesting to people, and I think that's something you understand. So, but in my heart of hearts, I always have the best, most positive feelings towards other people. Most other people, there's a few influencers that are not my favorite people, but most other people, even the people I critique, there are good things that I can find to say about them. For example, like I'm not the biggest fan of well, I'm definitely not the biggest fan of Huberman. He might be more on the negative side for me, but I can fully admit that he's an unparalleled speaker and presenter of information, even though I disagree with a lot of it. But yeah, so that's where I'm coming from. I'm still mostly plant-based, but I'm super open to arguments for animal products and for people who have different points of view from me. The main reason I reached out to you again is because we both have this sort of part of this debunking niche, but also because you think very differently than I do. So in a very lighthearted manner, I thought to talk with you. I actually just sent you an email on a whim, but I've never sent anybody else an email to do something like this before. So maybe there's just something drawing me to it. I have no idea why, but there's something about you that I find interesting, and I would just like to have a conversation.
You bet. Well, I'm very, very pleased to have such a conversation. When people see me advertise this stream, when I do the editing and put it up, people will expect that you and I are going to go at it absolutely. What they won't necessarily have in their minds, a lot of them, is that both you and I, as you've identified for yourself, and I'm absolutely the same, we do definitely have a flair for the dramatic. A lot of what you see me do online in my videos about others is absolutely for clicks. The presentation style, the abrasiveness, the sweariness, the dressing up in military uniform and playing characters of that kind. The meat militia is what it's called, Kevin, if you haven't heard of it.
I've seen that.
Yeah, we are all about debunking the nonsense on the other side of the argument, the antithetical stuff. So yeah, it should be an interesting discussion indeed. Let's start, if you don't mind, with what leads you really to a position where you would believe that a plant-based approach to nutrition is appropriate for a human being at large, broadly?
I love that question because I'm not often answer these really broad questions, and at the very moment, I don't know exactly how to answer it. So let me see. It's such a basic question. It's such an obvious question to answer, and you should have an answer to it. But we often get so much into the nitty gritty of the details that we often don't answer and talk about those big picture questions. So let me see if I can do my best about this. And I'm sure pretty much every point you're going to reject, which is fine. More plant-based. I'm going through a bunch of different data points in my mind. So I think have you had a chance to read Burkett and Trowell? And by the way, or do you really want to go? You want to go at it in this discussion? Is that what the goal is?
Well, I mean, it's you that's requested the discussion, which I'm delighted to have, more than happy to have. And I mean, I can react to the way you want to approach it. You do need the caveat. I've given the caveat to you in an email privately previous to this discussion, and I'm quite happy to make it public as well, that we decided not to have a debate per se and swap references per se. And I did say to you quite clearly that my position will be that absolutely everything that you could probably refer to that is work that has been done within the ring-fenced area of ideology known as the human nutrition science, I'm going to reject outright as pseudoscience, nonsense, crackpottery, and being singularly lacking in actually anything like the required level of scientific discipline, research design, randomization, control and observation to remotely inform us, cause and effect on any aspect of hard health outcomes in human beings over any period of time, short or long. And my position is based in the quite extensive study that I've been involved in for 27 years now as someone who's into comparative anatomy and physiology, organ system studies, biological pathways, the actual hard science of the anthropology of the development of the species, Homo sapiens sapiens. Darwinian theory comes into it, of course, in terms of positive and negative selection pressures, in terms of how that builds our body plan and our metabolic plan and our organ system plan and how we actually function. Those aspects of our herbivorous past, some 5 million years ago, that have and have not been knocked out for whatever reason. So absolutely we can discuss the flaws, foibles and faults with any so-called study of human nutrition, so-called reductionist stuff that you want to get into. And I'll probably just ask you the same questions about them. Okay, like number one, is this a properly designed, properly randomized, properly powered, properly tenured interventional research study with human beings locked in labs under observation for multiple decades? No? Okay, well, shall we move on to the next study then? And that will probably shorten the discussion quite a bit, I would think.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I hear you about the lack of, and I'm sure you've had this discussion with other people. So another thing I'm going to tell you is going to come as a surprise to you, but I'll make my case nonetheless, even though you've probably heard it. Mm-hmm. I agree with you that we don't have.
Sorry, you're breaking up a bit there, Kevin. We'll just wait a minute.
Basic biology in a lab, where you, although in many.
Okay, we've got a poor internet connection here. Can you just try that bit again, Kev?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, gotcha. Yep.
Yeah, you were breaking up a little bit on this end a little bit earlier. Hopefully this doesn't impede us. If it does, we can always just reconnect and we'll see what happens. But so I'm sure you've heard all the arguments I'm going to give you. I'm sure you've heard them before. I'm sure nothing is going to come as a surprise to you, but I'm going to, give them nonetheless because you're asking what, you're curious about what my position is perhaps. And I do think that there is maybe an interesting counter argument to what you're saying. So specifically, I agree with you 100% that we don't have good interventional studies in nutrition. We have good experimental studies in, say, biology, maybe in physics, and many other fields, maybe not astronomy, for example. Astronomy tends to be an observational science, and there's quite a lot of speculation and conjecture, based on that observational science. But many hard sciences, we have good experimental evidence. We don't have a lot of that in nutrition. We have short-term biomarker studies. We have nutritional epidemiology, which I know you dislike. We have animal studies, which are, they're not humans. We have as you pointed out, evolutionary conjecture, evolutionary paleoarchaeological evidence, and paleoanthropology, and we have comparative anatomy. We have all that stuff, but none of that is direct. None of that directly allows us to causally infer while getting rid of all confounders. So instead, we have to draw upon all those different pieces of evidence in order to come to our conclusion. So I think the case, as far as I understand it for you, is you kind of totally dismiss nutritional epidemiology. But let me ask you this question. For paleoanthropology, looking at the evolutionary record in humans and then drawing conclusions about what the optimal human diet should be based on that, what about the gaps in the evidence there? Do you think we have a perfect record there?
No, I don't think the record there is perfect. What I think, though, is that the inference is as close to perfect as science will ever get to. And the reason I say that is because the specific anthropological data I refer to quite often in this regard is the stable isotope testing done on the collagen found in the long bones of human skeletal remains from all over the planet, of all ages up to and including well over 100,000 years old. All of that data agrees. It's all within a 5% band for any set of skeletal remains found anywhere on the planet of any age, up to about 12,000 years ago, when the human diet suddenly changed at the time of the Agrarian Revolution. So between 8 and 12,000 years ago, basically. Prior to that, it seems like the isotope testing is able to inform us very, very accurately on exactly what the trophic level of human beings was throughout that period. And it's absolutely unequivocal, and it's really, really clear what human beings absolutely did eat. So then all
hyper-carnivores, right?
Yeah. So what the data suggests to us is 80% plus of the so-called calories was in the form of animal flesh and animal fat, and about 20% or less was in the form of largely fibrous roots and tubers. That's about it, actually. And as such, that's what we are, obligate hypercarnivores. All you need to do is apply the Darwinian, you say conjectural theory. It's not, it's a fact.
I'm not. I don't think that Darwinianism or Darwinian evolution is a conjecture. I think that inferring the diet from the fossil, from the isotope record that you're talking about, that was what I referred to as somewhat conjectural. But of course, I don't think that Darwinian evolution is anything but a fact.
Right. Okay. Excellent.
Just to clarify.
Good. All right. So, what issues would you have with the isotope testing?
So I've talked to some experts about these data, not people who, I'm trying to think. I don't think there are people who are involved in these specific studies. There are just anthropologists who are involved in. So, for example, Herman Ponzer, who does a lot of stuff he's done a lot of stuff with Hadza. He does a lot of stuff with metabolism, and he's a sort of quantitative physical anthropologist, very interested in quantifying sort of fundamental truths about human biology. So he hasn't necessarily done any studies directly on this topic, but he's a very smart person, thoughtful person. So, and then of course he knows a lot of the people in the field. What I understand from him, based on our discussions about these data and about Mickey Ben-Dor has a really influential paper that you're probably on the same page about most of that paper. Would that be correct?
Mostly, yeah. I mean, I don't agree 100% with anybody except myself, to be fair. But that's for another day.
Sure. Yeah. So him and a couple other people, they had a couple papers. But yeah. So based on talking to him about the isotope record, my understanding is that it's true that most of the protein that humans were ingesting came from animals. I think there's no question about that according to the isotope data. I'm wondering where you get and why you think most of the calories necessarily did, because it could be the case, as far as I understand, maybe you can correct me, but I thought it could be the case that there was a lot of animals consumed, but there still could be a substantial amount of calories coming from plants, say, for example, low protein plants. For example, tubers. Tubers are a good example. Fruits are a good example of a low protein plant food that wouldn't necessarily strongly show up in the nitrogen isotope record because it doesn't have a lot of protein. And so therefore wouldn't dilute that much, but it could still provide a substantial number of calories from plants. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, so my issue with that idea, or my response, if you like, to that idea is twofold. Number one, the nitrogen isotope testing is kind of corroborated quite well by carbon isotope testing as well.
Okay.
In terms of the caloric intake idea. Secondly, you need to understand, or one needs to understand, I should say, that the tubers that humans had available to them that they were eating at that time were not remotely similar to what you can go down the supermarket and buy today. They were not full of starch. They were not rich sources of carbohydrate. They were almost entirely fibrous. And as such, given that the human digestive tract has almost no capacity to cultivate any serious amount of bacteria that can actually undertake fermentation of fiber to any meaningful degree, it's extremely unlikely that a significant amount of calories were being taken in that form. A couple of weeks a year, maybe, when there were regional berries and various fruits available. I mean, even in the equatorial zone, fruits still have a season. They weren't being produced all year round. The other thing to understand is that for most of the time that we're talking about here, we were in a glacial period for almost the entirety of that time. And as such, you know, the rich so-called bounty of plant materials and stuff that are available to humans today just simply did not exist. They were not on the planet. So
even in the equatorial regions?
Yeah, even there were very, very few edible plants to be had, is my understanding of the readings in that area and the assertions that are being made around the flora that was available to humans on the planet. So, yeah, it just seems to be an incredibly unlikely thing that human beings relied upon any amount of plant material as a way to subserve their requirement for energy. Absolutely, we know that to build their body structures and anything containing any significant amount of protein, we know absolutely where that came from. The nitrogen testing is unequivocal on that. The carbon testing isn't able to be as unequivocal, I should say, is my understanding of it, but it does corroborate, would be the best word I've seen used on that, in terms of there wasn't a huge amount of carbohydrate being taken in.
So you can tell through carbon testing how much carbohydrate is being taken in. Is that the idea? Yeah,
largely that's the idea. There are more issues with carbon testing than there is with nitrogen. It's a much more difficult task to be unequivocal, and as such, my understanding is that the carbon data can only be used as a kind of corroboration to the much more unequivocal nitrogen data. Now, if I've got that wrong in any way, then anybody that's an expert in that can absolutely let me know so that I can adjust my message. But I don't think I've got that wrong.
That's interesting. I'll look that up later. It sounds reasonable to me. And something else that I've constantly been very interested in is what you're pointing out with respect to the flora on the equator. Because as far as I understand, humans only entered Europe not too long ago, within the last 100,000 years.
Yep.
Understand, especially culture.
Okay, sorry, we're just breaking up. You're just breaking up again there, Kevin. Let me just wait for a minute for it to clear up. There it is, I think. Can you just repeat from the part about humans entering Europe about 100,000 years ago?
If we're still going, can you hear me?
Yep, gotcha. Yep.
We gotta wait a second.
Okay.
Okay. All right. You can hear me?
Yep.
I can't. Okay. You're kind of, I guess your video is catching up. You can hear me right now?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So my understanding is humans only entered Europe, especially Northern Europe, within the last, my dates are not super precise, but it's been within the last 100,000 years, especially Northern Europe. And even if we're talking about Scandinavia, that's not necessarily exactly around the time of agriculture, but not long before the beginning of agriculture. So I've long been curious about before we entered Europe, and then maybe even during the Ice Age, which is and during the last 100,000 years, what did the flora look like on the equator, and was it even possible for humans to be eating a lot of plant foods? Now, your point about tubers makes a lot of sense to me, and I agree with you that we weren't getting a lot of calories from fiber. I know, personally, because I've eaten a lot of fiber before, you can't go much above 100 grams of fiber a day without problems. So clearly you're not digesting that. It would be interesting if you have any references, or you can point me in the right direction of references about what flora were actually available on the equator around that time, because that does seem to be a really interesting and important part of the argument. But I have no reason to believe that you're wrong. So let's assume that you're right. Okay, let's assume that you're right, and I'll double check some stuff. We'll talk about it maybe offline after this is over.
Sure.
But let's assume you're right, and that's fine. Okay, but that's only the last 100,000 years. Why do we think necessarily two things, actually? Why do we think necessarily that before that 100,000 years, I don't know what time the transition to a more animal-based diet would have been made. Why would we think that the evolution during that time is not important for also determining the human diet today? And the second, and I know there's some obvious arguments, but okay. But then the second argument, thought is, why do we think that the time since the agricultural revolution occurred, that hasn't affected in terms of the evolution, the optimal human diet? Because I know a really interesting, there's a paper by Harpending and Cochrane, I think 2007, where, and I'm not super familiar with the molecular methodology that they used, but they quantified the rate at which certain parts of the genome changed over time. So they have genomes from different periods of time, and they identified, or they claimed to identify based on the methodology that they used. Again, I don't know about the integrity of the methodology or whether it's still up to date in 2022, but let's assume, or if you have any information otherwise. But my understanding, according to them, is the rate at which changes in the genetics into human beings has been accelerating over the past 40,000 years, especially, and probably over the past 10,000 years in particular. And that's probably been due to population growth. So if you have, it's like insects. If you have a large insect populations occur so quickly, they can evolve very quickly. So they can evolve resistance to pesticides and that kind of thing very fast. Well, same thing as humans. If you have a huge population of humans, then evolutionary change can occur more quickly. Likewise, if you have a lot of really strong evolutionary pressures, a lot of stresses on the population at the same time, then you can also have large changes. So the question is why wouldn't our herbivorous past or our more recent, granivorous present, Neolithic present, why wouldn't that affect our optimal diet? Why do we necessarily assume that it's only, the last 100,000 years that's most important before the agricultural revolution?
Right. Okay. So in terms of the first part, it is believed, my understanding is that it is believed that human beings in our current speciation have walked the earth for 350,000 years, give or take. The reason that we're assuming that the 250,000 years before 100,000 is because we don't have the isotope testing older than about 100,000 years. And with what we understand from the area of environmental anthropology, that the climate of the Earth was relatively stable throughout that period. There were a couple of interglacial periods for relatively short periods of time during that period, but mostly it was muchness. So the assumption is based around no reason to suggest otherwise. Prior to that, in species that were nearly human but not quite human, leading up to the human existence, it is thought, my understanding, is that our ancestors came down from the trees roughly 5 million years ago, 4.5, 5 million years ago, give or take. And they stood up right at that time and said, look, yummy, yummy, all of these beasties here on the plains that weren't glaciated at the time, let's eat those. How are we going to do that? We're going to dive at them with our open mouths, with our sharp, but no, we're going to get pointy sticks is what we're going to do. And we're going to develop language and we're going to develop large brains so that we can think about this and strategize and work together and all of that. And the growth of the brain is going to be subserved by this vastly richer nutrition than we're getting from animals than we could possibly have ever got from plants while we were doing that, blah, 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 blah. So that's that. So there's a bit of conjecture there, absolutely. Quite happy to reject any part of that with any kind of data that would lead us to reject it at any time in the future. But in the meantime, I'm happy that that's pretty much the history in a nutshell. In terms of the rapid changes recently, I think that it's reasonable to suggest that when you distress any species markedly, that it will respond more rapidly than it would otherwise have done to that specific stressor. And there will be changes to the genome of that animal, absolutely. Example, we have flies that live around this area that you can spray with any amount of fly spray and they will look at you like, what's your problem? So what? Is that all you got? Sunshine. In other words, they react very, very rapidly. Their lifespans are much shorter. Their genes can move much quicker than ours, sure, but it's an example of exactly what you're talking about. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to suggest that in, maybe even 12,000 years of attempting to change our diet to a more plant-based, more agrarian way of doing things has caused our genes to change somewhat. Now, that would be evidenced absolutely by the fact that there are many people running around who either claim to or indeed do eat an entirely plant-based diet, and it doesn't kill them stone dead. It takes years and years and years to destroy their health doing that. Nonetheless, they will absolutely destroy their health individually doing that, because it absolutely will destroy your health trying to do that. But it doesn't kill those people stone dead. So there is a capacity for human beings to cope with adversity for years and years and decades even at a time. And I've never really argued otherwise. All I've ever said is, look, it seems to me, based on all the stuff I've been talking about thus far, that it seems sensible to follow a diet which is underpinned and informed by our body plans, our organ systems and all of that, for the vast majority of our existence. Given that genes do tend across time to move relatively glacially, and I'm not dismissing what you're saying, I'm saying, yes, there has been some drift in the last even 10,000 years. Sure, absolutely. But still, it seems that with our current genetics, our current body plan, our current organ systems, our current metabolic setup, human beings are vastly better on an entirely animal plant-based diet?
Cool. I have a really cool example for you, actually, about rapid evolution in the diet.
Yep.
So I don't know if you've heard this example. Let me see if I can pull this up. And it just occurred to me as we were talking about this. Check this out. Well, I mean, this is not as fast as 12,000 years, but this is still pretty fast. So even though, and I tweeted this in like 2021, even though the polar bear and the grizzly bear species diverged only 150,000 years ago, the polar bear gets more than 90% of its energy from meat. And maybe you'll correct me on this. I don't know if you think the second part that's coming up. While the grizzly bear gets more than 90% of its energy from plants.
Okay.
This example demonstrates that dietary evolution can occur very rapidly. Do you think that? Yeah, so I think that's super interesting. So 150,000 years, it's not 12,000, but you go all the way on the one hand to hyper carnivore to like grizzly is almost an herbivore, as if this 90% figure is correct. I'm not sure if it is.
I'm really not an expert on bears, so I can't really comment on bears. My absolute expertise is human physiology. And human organ systems and human biological process and all of that. So I kind of tend to try to keep my commentary in that area insofar as is possible. Look, I think absolutely that what you're saying there is perfectly feasible about rapid evolution under times of stress and changing our diet from what it was for probably largely 4.5 million years, a very similar diet, to the last maybe 10 or 12,000, or 8 to 12,000, sorry, to something completely different, suddenly like that, that is a distressor. That will cause a change in our genetics over time. I don't think we're there at this point where we can say a human being can possibly expect better health on a plant-based diet throughout the lifespan than they could if they ate an animal-based diet, by which I mean hypercarnivore, by which I mean over 80% of the effective energy in the form of animal products. I just don't think you can say that.
Sure. So with that, I want to introduce my point of view, why I think what I do, because actually talking to you has, I don't know how to say it, so right now, I don't really engage much in the so-called diet wars anymore because they're too frustrating to me. And I'm right now trying to finish graduating, and I'm like interested in doing jujitsu. I love jujitsu a lot, but this conversation has rekindled a lot of the pathways in my brain, so to speak. So it's now easier for me to articulate my position, if that makes sense. I don't know. But for whatever reason, I feel a little bit more comfortable. So for me, the main reason, the main driver, the main motivator, and it's funny because, the main motivator for me is probably ethical and environmental. So first of all, I don't like factory farming, and I think it's atrocious, especially bad for pigs and for chickens. Cows, it can vary depending upon the feedlot. Some feedlots are actually very good to the cattle. Some feedlots are worse. So that's less of an ethical issue to me. But I especially don't like how a lot of cows and chickens are treated. It's a very concentrated, industrialized form of agriculture that has no. There's more concern about animal welfare than there used to be, but it still emphasizes efficiency to the expense of the well-being of the animal. So the animal's not, in its natural environment. It's not psychologically sound. It's not happy. The chickens will peck the cages until their beaks bleed. They'll peck each other. They have to be debeaked in order to avoid that behavior. Pigs will bite each other incessantly. They'll live in the same cage their entire life. So that's what bothers me. I'm not necessarily even super concerned with like death necessarily, like killing animals. It's kind of the circle of life. It may seem like wrong, or it may seem like bad that things have to kill each other, but like it's just how animals live, and it's how human beings live. It's how nature is. And so it's kind of weird to go against that to me personally. So I'm not necessarily against animals being killed, but I don't like the way that they're treated. So that's my first concern, is the ethical concern. The second, and then so in order to feed the entire population animal products, you have a real ethical dilemma, because you have to have these industrial farming operations. Everybody has to be fed enormous amounts of animal products. And then you have this ethical catastrophe, in my opinion. So the second reason is the environmental reason. Maybe you could do something like chickens and pigs in concentrated feedlots, or these industrial feeding operations. And that could be relatively environmentally friendly. But if you're talking about cattle, as far as I understand the statistics and how that stuff is concerned, we can't feed everybody like an all beef or 50% or 80% beef calories diet on the planet. It like literally, it would take up enough like land to account more than the total land area of Earth to do that, because you have to feed cattle grains and all that stuff. And in order to raise cattle, again, this is my understanding, in order to raise cattle in an industrial level, it's actually more land efficient than it is if you do free range cows. If you do free range cows, it's even worse. It's like you need like 5 Earths to do pure free range cows, and we just don't have enough physical land. Now, if we're only talking like a certain portion of the Earth's population, yeah, that makes sense. Or if we're talking about like depopulating the Earth, I don't know if you believe that we should do that. Maybe we should. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but certainly at the current levels of human beings on the planet, my understanding is that it's environmentally untenable simply on a land basis. Now we can talk about climate change and all that stuff. That's a little bit more less tangible. And I'm not like we get into stupid controversy that we don't strict land. So from my more of a, and then I'm trying to understand, okay, so based on that ethical and environmental constraint, what can we say about like the ability for human beings to be healthy on plant-based diets? Now, this gets into the other parts of the why I think that it somewhat makes sense. And I'm still sympathetic to your point of view, because if what you're saying is the facts, it's the facts. Like, who cares what I think about like what should be the case? It's just like, it's the facts are the facts. But I also think that there's some data, maybe it's less rigorous and robust than you might think. I'd be interested to hear what you say about that. But there's some data, especially if you look at, there's this book called Western Diseases and what is it? It's by Burke and Trowell. It's from the 1980s. Survey different populations in Africa, maybe some in Asia as well, agrarian populations. They look at the nutrition transition of these populations from plant-based diets to Western diets. And they show that, people are completely free of cardiovascular disease, et cetera, et cetera. They're eating predominantly a plant-based diet in Africa. And then they switch to not an American diet, but a Western diet. Now, I don't know what the cause is of the changes in disease rates. It could be like the fiber, the flour, the oils, whatever it is. But they switch from a predominantly plant-based diet to a predominantly Western diet, and they find that the rates of disease go up. So my question is like, what do you think? I mean, do you think that these? I mean, I get okay. Let me think about what I'm going to say here, because I don't want to ask a dumb question. Do you think that? I mean, do you think that plant-based people eating predominantly plant-based diets can't be healthy? And why do you think that's the case? Because, okay, so one more point of evidence. We don't even. Okay, here's another point of evidence is if you look at the epidemiological literature, I'm not saying necessarily that plant-based diets are optimal. They might not be optimal, but at least people who tend to consume plant-based diets
Okay. This is frustrating.
Being predominantly plant-based diets. Pritikin is another one who documented a lot of this stuff. You probably don't have fond feelings about Pritikin. And then what do you think about the epidemiological literature, and how do you sort of address these two data points for the feasibility of plant-based diets.
Okay. Many threads there, and you broke up a bit there in the last bit. I'm going to assume that you were suggesting that people who tend to eat plant-based diets tend to show better health status and improvement in their health status with respect to those on a standard or Western diet.
I should say this. I should say not necessarily that. Let's make a weaker claim, because I think that we get into weird territory there. Let's make a weaker claim. Let's just say that people on predominant plant-based diets, they do pretty well. Like, they don't do terribly, and they certainly do better than the Western diet. So,
right, okay.
Is your argument that they would be even better off if they had a meat-based diet?
It is, yes.
Than they are on a plant-based diet?
Yes, it is. Yeah. It is. What I'm going to suggest to you, Kevin, and I've already suggested it to my supporters many, many times over as many years as I've been doing this, and that is that the worst possible diet that a human being can consume is the standard Western or standard American diet. That will kill you quicker than any other diet that exists anywhere. Pretty much. It's strictly contraindicated for human health, short and long term. And you should stay away from that, absolutely. The vegan or plant-based diet is superior to the standard Western diet. It seems for the first, on average, about 5 years or so. The reason for that is the alleviation of the Randall cycle issue. However, after about 5 years on a plant-based diet, on average, problems will start to rear their ugly heads because of the vast destitution of nutrition for human beings available on a plant-based diet. The statistics show us that 84% of people who ever decide to go vegan quit that. They quit within 5 years, and they cite catastrophic health failure born of nutrient deficiency as their reason. 90% of those people. So those are the anecdotes on that. There is no evidence, there is no experimental work available, so I can't point to any of that. But then neither can anybody else on any aspect of human nutrition as that relates to any aspect of hard health outcome in human beings, because there simply isn't any extant anywhere in the literature. So that answers the question about what are my thoughts on epidemiology. It is not only not good science, it is not science at all. It is not even closely akin to science. It is actually anti-scientific in the way that it is conducted and communicated about by those who are involved in that area of ring-fenced ideology in human nutrition. They use words like risk, which an epidemiological study cannot inform upon. It is an associative study, and in fact, it would only be a valid associative study if those authors would report what they actually observed. They don't. They adjust their outcomes to suit whoever their funding source is. That is not science. Scientists design a interventional research program in advance. They then conduct that under adequate discipline and control and observation and tenure and statistical power and all those good things. And they report what their observations actually were. Epidemiologists in the nutrition field, at least, and I am delimiting my comments to nutrition epidemiology here, what they do is they collect a bunch of data points which are completely uncontrolled and completely free-living human beings with as many confounds and basically destructors of the validity of the thing as you want to point any number of sticks at, and then they ignore that data anyway and report something completely different. So that's just not even science. That's just rubbish, all of it. Even if it was of any value in terms of a clinical outcome, like when you look at epidemiology on something like smoking and lung cancer, for example, while that is also not a cause and effect study, the inference there is pretty powerful. The change in incidence of lung cancer in smoking populations versus their so-called research twins is 11,500% per pack year of smoking.
Right.
Epidemiology studies find differences between subpopulations, between the highest and lowest consumption of, for example, animal products, of something like 10, 12, 15% relative differences on a disease process like heart disease or cancer or mortality, whatever, which had a baseline incidence in the first place of around about 8 per 10,000. So what you've basically got there maybe is somewhere between 8 and 10 100,000ths, meaning, one extra case of mortality per, 8 extra cases of mortality, 8 to 10, per 100,000 person years of follow-up. So even if it was rigorous, which it isn't, well controlled, which it isn't, properly, put together, which none of that epidemiology is, with outcome statistics that close to zero, pass the stake. I don't give a shit in that case. It's of no value to me as a individual human being, not over a 100-year lifespan. It's useful to policymakers, perhaps, who have purse strings to look after, who might erroneously assume that this associative mishmash and claptrap is actually causal and thus make decisions about how they're going to spend their money on the basis of it. That'd be wrong. But even if they were right, that has no impact on my life or yours. So it's worthless. So that answers the epidemiology question. It's just junk. It's garbage. All of it.
Sure.
All of it. So there's that. Let's deal with the ethical and environmental parts that we spoke about, or you spoke about some minutes ago now.
Yeah.
My take on what is best for human beings is a sans ethic argument. It's a statement on what is biologically indicated. There are ethical ways of sourcing meat. When I can, I do. Absolutely. We're very lucky in New Zealand where I live. It's all grass-fed, all pretty much free-ranging beef all the time. Same with our lamb. Chickens, I don't tend to eat a lot of chicken whatsoever, and when I do, I make sure it was free-range. The same with eggs. If I'm having eggs at all, I make sure they come from a free-range egg farm. In fact, the eggs do come from a free-range egg farm, which is about 200 metres from where I'm sitting right now. Furthermore, the beef that will be making up the large proportion of my diet for the next several months came from a cow who was born here on this property, lived here, ate the grass here, over the fence about 5 metres from where I'm now sitting. And, he's now serving another purpose in that regard. So, environmentally, as well as ethically, I live as blameless a life as I possibly can. Your point about there being far too many human beings on the planet, far more than the planet can happily support, is correct. I agree with that. There are too many human beings on the planet. That has occurred because of using technology, including the agrarian revolution technology, to allow more human beings to subsist rather than to allow a more reasonable number of humans to really exist in prime health. What we have is a vastly overpopulated planet, and it's vastly overpopulated by people who are sick, chronically ill and unwell because of the way that we've been told and the nonsense we've had forced down our throats about the pseudoscience known as human nutrition and health studies and the allopathic medicinal model and big pharma and all of that sort of stuff that we can get into another time if you want to. So basically the ethical thing to me is irrelevant. I'm as blameless as I can be. It's not possible to have no footprint and no effect on other creatures on the planet. You can't live without other creatures dying to feed you. Example, if you eat a plant-based diet, your diet is directly, causally, unequivocally, and unarguably associated with a vastly, vastly larger number of animal deaths. animal, agriculture, the kind of monocrop agriculture that is required to feed human beings a plant-based diet absolutely kills animals in their trillions. Just because you're not eating those animals doesn't mean that those animals are not, that blood of those animals are not on your hands.
Who Avi Bitterman is? Do you know who Avi Bitterman is?
Yes, I know who he is.
Yeah. So one of the things that I noticed whenever he would do his Discord debates with different people who made that point, he wouldn't really be able to address it. It's
because it cannot be addressed, Kevin.
Although now
it's unequivocal. You cannot get away from that. Avi Bitterman is a little boy in short pants academically. I think he's got about 2 peer-reviewed publications under his belt, if you're lucky, one of which is an opinion piece, a letter to the editor. The other one I think is not even an experimental design of any kind. I think it's some kind of review that was uninvited that somehow got published. He's a sophist. Him and his little mates like to hide in their mummies' basements, electronically holding hands and circle jerking each other and congratulating each other about how clever they are, that they can overpower someone with their sophistry. If you really want a good laugh one day, Kevin, if you go to my other platform, not my YouTube platform, my other video sharing platform, which you might have to take an odyssey of journey to discover, but if you did take such an odyssey, you'd probably find it, and you will find a recording of a discussion I had with Avi one afternoon on my Discord channel, where I spanked him around the ring for 45 minutes and punched the boy bloody. Verbally, that is, of course, because we're on separate continents. If you want to see a little boy led around by his nose and taught a lesson by an actual scientist, that's where you'll find that. So, there you have it. And I'll just wait for you to come back because you're frozen up again. God, it's been frustrating today with internet. It's probably at my end. I live rurally, and we're in a third world country here in the former New Zealand, which is now known as the totalitarian regime of Jab Sinda Hardonistan. So, anyway, you're back. Good to see you. And now you're waiting for me.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I've got you. Yep.
Hello.
Hello. Frustrating, isn't it, boys and girls?
I can't. I'm turning my video back on.
Okay.
It is frustrating. You know that I didn't hear everything that you said about Avi, but can you see me?
Yeah, gotcha.
Oh no! Is it? We're still back to.
I've got you. You just haven't got me clearly at the moment.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I've got you. Yep.
No, this is a this is a good moment to practice our ability to cope with this frustration. This is pretty, but whatever. It is what it is.
Yep.
So yeah. I heard the start of what you said about Avi, and I'm not going to say I agree or disagree because I don't want his mob to come after my Twitter account or any of my accounts. I don't want them to come. I just don't have the energy to deal with that stuff.
Yeah.
But I just remember that whenever he tried to, like, people would come on and talk about that issue, he wouldn't have a way to address it. And it makes sense to me what you're saying, which is why I don't base. Yeah, but again, like. Okay. So there's a few things. First thing I would say is I know the majority, the plurality, like the biggest proportion of people, what they report is actually health problems. They don't feel good, et cetera, et cetera. And who knows, like, how many other people are experiencing health problems but are reporting other reasons, because those other reasons are actually driving their decisions, but they are actually also having health problems. I've been on a vegan diet a couple times. I felt terrible. And I also know that, like, I shouldn't say this, but, like, a lot of vegans that I know, like, they don't seem right sometimes. Like, they seem kind of, like, stressed out. And I wonder if a lot of that has to do with, like, them not being well nourished. I don't know exactly what it is. Are we disconnecting again?
No, you're okay. You're okay. It's frustrating, and I think we'll probably put it down to a bad day internet-wise here in New Zealand, in the former New Zealand, now known as the totalitarian regime of Jabsinda Hardonistan. You know, we do our best. I'm living rurally, and I'm still on copper wire internet, for God's sake, and some days it's just unusable. So that's probably what's going on.
It's probably on my end also. So it's like both of us. I'm also in the middle of nowhere in Texas. So, you know, we're both in the middle of nowhere across the world talking to each other. Yeah. But yeah, I agree about that too. I think there's some serious nutrition issues with respect to vegan diets. I don't think I'm not saying nobody can thrive on them. Probably there's some people out there who will be okay in the long run. Maybe. I don't know. Like, I don't think we know. I don't think we have the science to say like definitively one way or the other. But, you know, my experience has not been positive. My experience with vegans has generally not been very positive. As you say, most people don't stay on the diet. Most people cite health problems. That's why they come off of that, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's some serious nutritional issues. And I also think that there's clearly important compounds in animal products that have health benefits, and they don't exist in plants. Like, they're just not there. Like, there's a million things we could talk about, and I'm sure to talk about all of them. Like, choline is in low quantities in plant foods, creatine, carnosine, taurine. Taurine's a whole very interesting compound that still we have hundreds of research studies on, but we still don't fully understand the full effects of it. And there's a range of other compounds, as you know, and good randomized controlled trial evidence on positive changes of biomarkers associated with these compounds, blood pressure, glycemic control, et cetera, et cetera. So I wonder if it's good to make everybody plant-based. I don't think that's a good idea. That sounds like a bad idea. However, I still have the continued issue. So we have created this problem as a human species of an overpopulated planet, and we have to feed everybody. Now, one way of doing this, to just be frank, one way to do this, let's just go to the extreme, is to like kill a bunch of people off. Like, we just get rid of a lot of the planet. But that, like, first of all, that would be terrible. I don't know if you'd be willing to press the button. You don't have to tell me if you would or wouldn't. But
I wouldn't. No. Personally,
right. So, I mean, if I don't know, if you believed that the future of humanity depended on it, maybe some people would. But even if you or I would, even if one of us truly believed that, or both of us truly believe that, we still don't have the power to do that, even if that was the case. So, given that we don't even have the power to, and what's probably going to continue happening is we're just going to continue to have too many people on the planet. How do we, so this is, again, you and I can live according to however we want. And that's all well and good. But like, what about the future of policy? Like, how do we deal with this planet without, and I guess maybe that's not your niche. Like, that's not your interest. You're just interested in your followers and helping a small portion of the population. But if it's not scalable, there's a big problem. Now, one of the ideas that I've had. So we have plant foods. We have, and you probably hate this idea. You'll probably completely love this idea. But like, we have plant foods. We have good science and technology. We know or characterize what's deficient in plant foods compared to animal foods. We don't necessarily know the things in animal foods that they do, but we know what plausibly has some health benefits, and we certainly have some of them don't have problems with them. And we can characterize that if we want to. We could run randomized controlled trials to characterize the health benefits, at least in the short term, with short-term biomarker studies, or maybe even some short-term, like 5-year trials, whatever, with supplements. Why can't we just fortify? I know this sounds terrible to you. You're going to hate this, but why can't we just? I know you probably talked to people about this. Why can't we just fortify plant foods with the compounds that animal foods have, and then feed the population? That's my idea. That's my like dream right now. It's like my belief that we can do this. We don't have to have the Beyond Burger, the Impossible Burger. Those are crap because obviously those don't have adequate nutrition. There's questionable aspects about the protein, whatever. There's all sorts of other things. But conceivably, if somebody was smart and they knew the things you and I know, conceivably you could kind of hybridize these perspectives.
Yeah.
And I want, like, do you think this is appalling? This is appalling to hear, like, from an aesthetic or point of view? Or
okay, right. So my issue there is pretty simple, really, and it is that the problem with trying to subsist on a plant-based diet is not just what that diet lacks nutritionally, it's also problematic from the standpoint of the contraindications, the things that are actively damaging and destructive to human health. Things like
carbohydrate?
Things like carbohydrate, exogenous carbohydrate, which is absolutely contraindicated in the human diet in any amount above, it seems, roughly 50 grams a day maximum. Things like fiber, which is destructive to enteric function, which is pro-inflammatory, which destroys our health from the very colon outwards. Things like anti-nutrients, plant toxins, oxalate, phytates, tannic acids, these kind of issues that absolutely are yet to be established experimentally as problematic in terms of hard health outcomes. But tell you what, anecdotally, remove those things from someone's diet and things improve pretty well out of sight. So there's my issue with that. In terms of the human population thing, you know, as I said, I wouldn't push that button. I don't believe you're the sort of person that would want to push that button either. However, there is quite a, in my humble opinion, quite clear evidence that that button in the last 3 years, actually, Kevin. And what you will find, I think, if you watch this space over the next decade or two, you will find the human population will decrease massively. The signs that are already quite clear in my mind, and they're above the level of things that it is safe for us to discuss on YouTube. So we'll just leave it at that. But I will say to you that my opinion is that the button, and you just need to wait now and wait.
And this isn't stuff we can talk about on YouTube.
It's just not safe to talk about that on YouTube at all. But
we'll talk about offline. I'm curious. Sure. I think I probably have an idea of what you're talking about. Clearly, I mean, it's not something that I've considered, but yeah. Well, okay, but would you say it's a bad thing? Like, let's say if somebody has pushed. Are you against that?
Well, the ethics there are problematic, incredibly problematic. And yes, I have a problem with the ethical.
Yeah, but people. But we can people to our ancestral way. Well, I guess we're with life with that agenda, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay, so I missed a lot of that because of breaking up again. I think Kevin, we're at a point. I think we're at a level where we've probably got most of the cards on the table. I think what we should probably do if we're going to continue such a discourse is to do so on another day when the internet's a bit better, and probably when I can get back to my recording studio that can record decent quality material without reliance upon the interwebs, which is currently down for their issues. So that being said, there's probably very little to add at this point. I do want to thank Kevin in his pseudo presence for giving up the time this afternoon to have this discussion. It was interesting. It was worthwhile. And hopefully from there, okie dokie, we'll just close that down. And hopefully from there on another day, things will be less problematic for us. So thank you very much, Kevin, for that. I'm sorry, boys and girls, that the technology has been an issue for us. and we'll try and get back to it at another stage. Anyway, thank you for joining me. Join me next time when somebody else might be prepared to have a sensible, reasonable adult discussion with me about having different ideas about nutrition. All right. See you then.
I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please check me out on patreon.com at Kevin and Bass, where you can donate and make this podcast possible. Also check me out on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, where you can find my latest thoughts on the latest controversies and findings within health science. Also check me out at The Kevin Bass Show, both on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. I hope this podcast was useful to you. If it was, please leave me a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. See you guys in the next episode.